Welcome to the Classical Mind, a podcast about the great books in the Western canon. We're your hosts. I'm Father Wesley Walker.
And I'm Dr. Junius Johnson.
And man, I'm very excited for what we're about to start. We're embarking on another epic quest. We did Dante, that was fun, but now we're doing Lord of the Rings. And at least for me, given my background, this is almost more fun. Maybe not quite as spiritually edifying as Dante, but in some ways more fun of a journey.
Yeah, this is one of the most important books for someone like me who is a lover of the genre of fantasy literature. Because the claim is normally made that this is the birth of modern fantasy. It's the where it really comes from, and I think there's a lot to be said for that claim. It's when I look back, I see a much more continuous line of things. The generation right before Tolkien and Lewis, what they were doing, so crucial for what Tolkien and Lewis were able to do. But this does feel different. This is if I compare Lord of the Rings backwards to something like The King of Elfland's Daughter or something like that, it's a very different feel.
Mhm.
So I do think there is a sense in which we turned a corner when we get to Lord of the Rings, and some of that's because of what Tolkien was trying to accomplish with the mythology as a whole, which we'll have occasion to talk about in the future. But yeah, if you like magic and swords and elves and all that kind of thing, I mean, this is a can't miss. And it's also been very unusual as a fantasy book because where fantasy remains something of a niche genre, it's a very successful niche genre, but still, there's a lot of people who just, oh, I don't really go in for that. Lord of the Rings has always been able to bridge that gap and be more mainstream. It enters into university classrooms more easily than other books in the genre does. It's got something of that. It's seen as not just a piece of fantasy literature, but also as a literary work in its own right.
Yes, yes. I will say this just as a precursor. I'm not a big fantasy reader. I don't avoid it intentionally. It's just usually not the top of my to read list. I think when I'm reading fiction, I much prefer like the American novel or something like that.
Mm.
Um, but I love Lord of the Rings, and so I think the reason that I love Lord of the Rings is, and maybe this is just more of a personal historical accident. Of course, it's a great piece of literature, like you just said, but I was sort of catechized into Tolkien's world, and so it's something that's been with me since I was, I don't know, 8 years old, 7 years
Mm.
old. But the idea of getting into a new world always kind of exhausts me just at the beginning. Like, oh,
Mm.
I've got to learn this whole new way of that things are in this trilogy or this series, and that's different from Lord of the Rings, and I don't know. So I think that's one reason why I always come back to these books is that it's like I'm familiar
Mm.
with the world, and I like that. Again, that probably says more about me than the other books, but
Well, that is interesting that it is a heavy lift for Lord of the Rings in some ways because the world building is so deep and so rich.
yes.
And but he's done such a good job of you don't have to read any of that stuff, right? I mean, there's all these guys who are kind of like, oh, well, if, in this and in that and in this material and that one, and then he says this about this, and you can write
Appendix J
tables and
says,
memorize
yes.
charts, yeah, all that kind of stuff. And that's fine. It's all good stuff. But you can also just read the Lord of the Rings and ignore all of that stuff and never read it and get the experience you're meant to have. And I think that's something that a lot of subsequent writers haven't been as good at. They either go light on the world building and you can feel it, the worlds feel kind of anemic, or they go heavy on the world building and then they feel like they have to show you everything in the story. And it's like, well, but Tolkien went, as deep on the world building as probably anyone has ever gone. And nevertheless, he doesn't feel like he has to show it to you in the story. And that's a balance a lot of writers have not figured out.
And the world building is so cool. And I feel like this is one of the things that sets Middle Earth apart is that you read, I think, a modern fantasy trilogy, and the genre is basically the same across the works. Maybe things
Mm.
about the world unfold throughout the works. But with Tolkien, he writes three different works of different genres, all taking place in the same world. Right? The Hobbit is not the same thing as The Lord of the Rings, and then
Yeah.
the Silmarillion is even more different than the other two. So that is the kind of genius that we're dealing with in terms of world building. Now, before we get too far into it, I do want to do a show and tell. So
Mm.
for I've been reading these books to my boys, and for Christmas, my wife asked our youngest son Rowan what he wanted to get me, and Rowan said Sam Gamgee. And Caroline didn't know what to do with that, so she just put on Amazon, Sam Gamgee, and the thing that came up was a rubber ducky of Sam Gamgee. So if you're listening, you can't see the rubber duck, but that's maybe a good advertisement for checking us out on YouTube or the videos on Substack. But he's pretty cool, pretty fierce looking duck. So
Nice. That's awesome.
I love it. Now, Junius, when was the first time you read Lord of the Rings?
This is one of those times I get to really surprise you. I read Lord of the Rings for the first time when I was in college.
Really?
Yeah, right. See, I grew up on all of these Dungeons and Dragons novels, which are the trashy romance novels of the fantasy genre. But I didn't know that. I hadn't read anything any better, and um, I loved them, but they're really, really not very good. And I went back to them in college to sort of revisit my favorite ones, and I couldn't make it. I was like, this is such crap. But what they did was it was, the plot is the whole thing. It's about 95% of the book is what happens next. The villains are big and blustery and monologue-y. And, the other 5% is that dim flicker of recognition when you can tell, ooh, they just used this skill from the D&D game, or that was that spell from the spell list. This is what it looks like in prose. And of course, invariably, it didn't translate very well. Spells that were, not really powerful enough to be worth anything in the game were defeating whole troops of people in the books and this sort of a thing that they were never good at sort of matching those things up. But that was my experience. But I'd always been told Lord of the Rings, Lord of the Rings, Lord of the Rings. I had some friends who were really into it. It didn't make me want to read them because they were so far into it that it looked like the bar for entry was going to be very daunting. So I kept putting it off. And then finally, at some point in college, I don't remember what year it was, I read it, and I had a hard time at first. It was not what I expected. This sort of slow burn start, where you start in a small village and you wind up in a tavern and the adventure gets going. That was all familiar to me. That was the trope of the Dragonlance novels started their canonical first trilogy that way. So I thought that it was cool, but it just was taking a long time developing. And for the longest time, I was like, "Is Gandalf even a wizard?" Like, come on, man, let's do some spells. Let's go. Where's the magic at? And that was because I was reading it in the way that I've been trained to read these kinds of stories, which is you read for the plot, you read for the spells. But the book retrained how I read in a really fundamental way. After about the 15th stanza of Song, which was something I had no category for whatsoever, I began to realize somewhere deep inside that the way to read was to read for how the story was told rather than for what the story was. And this had a huge payoff in my life because I, after reading this book for the first time, or these books, however you want to call it, I went back to Moby Dick, which I had tried reading in junior year of high school, had really gotten super bored with it, skipped about 300 pages until the whale showed up and read the last 50 pages and thought, hey, these last 50 pages are great. After reading Lord of the Rings, I went back to the Moby Dick and I couldn't put it down. Every single page was so engrossing and so delicious because Melville is a masterful storyteller. Even when he's telling you about this is how we make soap and lamp oil from whale blubber, it's delightful. His language is absolutely delicious, but it took the Lord of the Rings to teach me how to do that. So I'm a latecomer to the game, but I guess sort of like the adult converts to Catholicism or whatever, like you're very zealous, perhaps even because you came late and you're aware of all the time that you missed out.
You're a rat trad Tolkien fan. That's super interesting. So, yeah, I have very much the opposite experience. So, I think I was probably 7 or 8 when the movie started coming out.
Mm,
And that was sort of my first entryway. I think we had bought The Fellowship of the Ring maybe at like Sam's Club or BJ's or something. I don't know why it was even being sold there, but we bought it there. And so I watched it. I remember being very freaked out by the
mm,
movie, being that young and watching it, but it was still very good. Like I knew it was good, even though it was
mhm,
scary. And so I started reading the books and
mm,
read all three of them. My best friend, growing up, he did not like the movie.
mm,
But his dad in college had been really into it and had the trilogy books. And so he let me borrow the books, which were kind of cool because he had had those for a long time. And
mm,
so yeah, I read them through, and then I used to do growing up. I used to do what I called Lord of the Rings Advent. 'Cause,
mm,
school gets out and you're home, and like before I was working or anything, there's nothing to do. So the 6 days before Christmas, I would watch half a Lord of the Rings movie a day, and I would also get the books out and try and keep up with the action unfolding on screen as I was reading. And so that was kind of a fun experiment. You have to skip large swaths of text, especially in the Fellowship of the Ring. But but yeah, so that was kind of a fun thing. So it was just all over. I mean, I remember playing the video games with friends all the time. I remember Lord of the Rings Risk was a big thing that we played.
Mhm.
It was just all over. I mean, it really was all the rage for those years. Those movies were huge events,
Mhm.
and so definitely was caught up in that. But really appreciated the world building and the storytelling of Tolkien, the lore kind of behind it. I appreciated all that. I remember reading the appendixes and getting reading as much as I could get my hands on at the time. They hadn't republished all the stuff that they've republished since then,
Yeah.
at that time. So I'm a little behind now in terms of there's not a ton of subsequent Tolkien stuff I've read.
Yeah.
But I do love to revisit this, and I'm currently reading this to our boys. I think I mentioned that already, but we're as of this recording, we're maybe halfway through the Two Towers, and
Mm.
so I'm hoping we can kind of keep up with our pace here, so that
Yeah.
that's kind of my read for this is to do it with them, and I'm having a fun time. Our oldest was a bit. I was like, oh, we really got to read Lord of the Rings. I think you're old enough. I think you'd love Lord of the Rings.
Mm.
And because I was pushing it so hard, he was kind of like, I don't know, maybe I want to read something else. And so finally I convinced him that now's the
Mm.
time. And he is now admits that he really likes it. So
Yeah.
I haven't ruined
Wow.
it completely.
Wow. Well, I should say we're planning later in the year to do a bonus episode on the Silmarillion.
Yeah,
And hopefully we'll bring Jonathan back for that. And so I'm going to use that as an excuse to punt a lot of the background stuff over to that episode because this is always when we talk about these books, it's painful because there's so much we don't get to say
yeah,
about them. You know, there's a our sister podcast, Close Reads, they're so lucky they get to go through the books in much more detail. But I think more so than anything that, um, except for Dante, and maybe in some ways even more so than Dante, there's just so much that's going to have to get left along the side of the road for these three texts as we go through them. So anything we can push off to do in another session would be really helpful.
that's fair.
Um,
And I also think maybe we should do an episode on the movies where we
right.
talk about how them on their own terms because I think they're worth a watch and they're so good. But we might get lost in the sauce if we are referencing the movies here. So let's
That's right.
try to.
That's a good point. That's a good point. And especially given that they were coming out at such a formative age for you. I was in graduate school, but I was going to see them at the midnight showings. I had to arrange my day around them so that I could stay awake for a 4 hour movie. So yeah, that'll be great. That's a good
Yeah,
point.
that'd be
So then
fun.
I
I,
would like to start with Hobbits, actually.
okay, you want to go there?
I do. This material in the opening about the Hobbits because there's something in it that's really quite cool that I didn't notice the first time around, and I think that this is a bit of a shtick for me that I want to get it out in the air in the open just for the sake of honesty. I I always do a little bit of a I always sigh when people praise hobbits and the hobbit lifestyle. Um, this sort of like wistful Windowberry like longing for the hobbit lifestyle. I get a little bit put out by it. And the reason in part is that The Hobbit has been a more of a companion for me than The Lord of the Rings. And in the hobbits don't come off very well. And the opening, the whole point is that the Hobbit love of leisure and comfort and all this other kind of stuff is a problem. And it's looked down on by the narrator. It's looked down on by Gandalf. And what's cool about Bilbo is that the only types of hobbits who ever beat this, the Tooks, Bilbo had their blood. And that's the thing that Gandalf wants to promote in Bilbo is the Tookish side. So Gandalf and the narrator really come down pretty hard against hobbits for being lazy and not concerned with important matters. The tone does shift here in The Lord of the Rings, and it's really important to keep in mind that, when Tolkien's telling The Hobbit as a bedtime story to Christopher, he doesn't know he's going to write The Lord of the Rings yet, and there's a lot that is important about The Lord of the Rings that hasn't yet come to fruition. So one has to take this as the canonical version, as his canonical take on hobbits. But I do think it's important to nod to that earlier sense. But we do get a much more idyllic and positive take of the hobbits' form of life in the beginning of this book. And I just want to read two little parts of it. The first is right at the beginning of the section called Concerning Hobbits, after that first little break there, the third paragraph. Hobbits are an unobtrusive but very ancient people, more numerous formerly than they are today, for they love peace and quiet and good tilled earth. A well-ordered and well-farmed countryside was their favorite haunt. They do not and did not understand or like machines more complicated than a forge bellows, a watermill, or a hand loom, though they were skillful with tools. And then I'm going to skip ahead. Um, this is right before the pipeweed bit, two paragraphs before that. It says, the craft of building may have come from elves or men, but the hobbits used it in their own fashion. They did not go in for towers. And that's after a section where it says, that there's a tower, an elf tower nearby from which you could see the sea. Not that any hobbit ever climbed it. Not that they really went to the sea and looked at it. This not going in for towers is a chilling line in light of the two towers and how dominant those things are going to be. And I thought that was the best line for putting in a nutshell what it is that differentiates hobbits from elves, dwarves, men, and all of the other great in the world. It makes perfect sense that Sauron made no rings for the hobbits because they don't aspire to the types of things that the rings represent.
He doesn't even seem particularly aware that hobbits are creatures that exist
Yeah.
until they find that they have the ring, and then he
Yeah.
cares a lot about them. But before that, it seems like he almost doesn't even, they're just not even
Know
significant
about
enough.
them.
They're not on his
Yeah.
radar.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that is a real mark of that's a theme that runs throughout the entire series is Sauron and Saruman overlook the hobbits. And not only that, but a lot of the wise also overlook the hobbits. Gandalf is almost alone in recognizing the value of the hobbits. And it's this sort of theme of, well, if you interpret the world in terms of power and its use value and that sort of a thing, these people don't seem very significant. And yet the fact of the matter is they're no less part of the story than anybody else.
Even the physical layout of Middle Earth kind of, I think, has something to do with this, right? Because you've got
Hmm.
the Shire kind of all the way up in the northwest of Middle
Hmm.
Earth, and then in the southeast is Mordor. And
Yeah.
even the way it's laid out, there is a kind of, I mean, where's the first place they go after they leave the Shire? They go to Elrond and Rivendell. So you get these elves. It's kind of they're kind of removed from the world too in their own way, and then but the closer you get to Mordor, so Mordor obviously is a bad place. There's a lot of evil
Mhm.
there, but what's right next to Mordor? Well, it's Gondor, the city of man, which is teetering on both sides, right? It could go either way. Like they say about the Fellowship, it's kind of hanging on the edge of the knife. It
Mhm.
could fall and become just another stronghold for Sauron, or it could resist and hold strong. So it's right in the middle of that. Not very far from there is Rohan, which
Mhm.
is also in a kind of perilous situation, but maybe not quite as much as there is in Rohan that sort of ruralism that allows a kind of removal from things. You get the sense that the people in Rohan are a bit more insular than the people in Gondor. The
Mhm.
Gondor folk tend to be more cosmopolitan, it seems like, and so they're more
But they're sort of
involved.
warrior people, the Rohirrim.
Oh, they are. They're warriors for sure. They're fierce, but they're still this kind of strong culture that they have. Like you read them and you feel like you're reading about the Norse or something,
Yeah.
kind of similar. So they have their own problems, but they're a little more removed, I think, than Gondor. And so I think it's just interesting, even that physical layout. So the distance
Mhm.
between the Shire and Mordor is there probably because we need a big hero's journey and that gives you enough space for it, but there is something about the removal of it. Like these are two polar opposite ways of being. Mordor is all
Yeah.
about a
Yeah.
kind of dominance and exploitation of nature,
Mhm.
and the Shire is all of this kind of ruralism.
Yeah, yeah. And I think there's two good points behind that geography. The one is, the Rivendell is called the last homely house. And it's last in the sense of all the homely houses have gone away. It's one of the last bastions of the elves of Middle Earth, although there is still Lothlorien. But also it is in the geography you described, it's the last place that is of any accounting in the minds of the great. Beyond Rivendell, it's just the Western Wildlands, where the Rangers can go and do rangery things, but there's really nothing, there's no kingdoms to speak of there, and that's where the Shire is. And the second thing is, it's not an accident, of course, that the hobbits have wound up in this spot so far from everything else, because when he talks about the wanderings of the various hobbit tribes, as it were, and they're looking for gaps where the big people aren't. And here, big people would include dwarves because even though they're not big in stature, they're big in building and in their their dreams and their kingdoms and these sorts of things. And the hobbits have been looking for quiet nooks and crannies in the world where they can settle down. So it makes sense that they have settled as far away from Mordor as it's possible to be and still be civilized following the map.
I think you're bringing up this point about hobbits, which I like, by the way. And I do think there's a tension there in Tolkien. I mean, he's more friendly to them perhaps in the beginning of Lord of the Rings than he is in The Hobbit. However, there's still that tension there for
Mhm.
sure, in terms of which is preferred, which is better, this
Yeah.
the kind of isolated, solitary life, idyllic, pastoral scene, or a more being in the thick of things and taking action and all that. That's definitely a big tension point throughout the book. And I mean, you think of like Ents, for example, they have the same kind of choice facing them, right? We can
Mhm.
continue doing our tree thing, or we can go invade or think, which we're getting ahead of ourselves on that. But
Mhm.
um, I suppose this raises a question for me, and this question is connected to a larger question. So the first question would be about the races in Middle Earth. So
Mhm.
dwarves, elves, men, orcs, hobbits. One could argue, and I've heard this argued before, that these are overly simplistic races,
Mhm.
that they are often depicted with a kind of essentialist, um, uh, black and whiteness to them.
Mhm.
Dwarves are greedy and they like to mine.
Mhm.
Hobbits are simple and they don't want to go on adventures.
Mhm.
Men are kind of maybe more the most complicated of the races because there is both goodness and badness kind of right there under the surface, and even in the same character like a Boromir, you see a strong sense of both. Elves are these kind of angelic, mystical creatures that are very, they want to meditate and they have lived forever, and so everything is kind of different for them. So on the one hand, I see that. On the other hand, I think there's something else going on here.
Mhm.
But I think before we can even ask that question about races, we have to ask, how do we read Lord of the Rings at all?
Mhm.
And I would propose a kind of three-tiered reading of it. Um, I don't know if you'll push back on this or not, but on the hand, I do think there's a kind of literal reading in which this is a fantasy, it's a myth. Tolkien loved myth, and this is him kind of taking his turn at telling a great myth.
Yeah.
He certainly studied those, and so on the one hand, we should just read it and kind of enjoy it on that level. I do think there is a kind of political commentary going on here. Tolkien,
Mhm.
obviously, very influenced by World War One. Where him and Tolkien are writing kind of around World War II, they do both seem to have the feeling that they should be writing stories they want to read and that those stories can change the world and for the
Mhm.
better. And so there's that going on. I do think there's political commentary, Saruman's kind of fall and his tendency towards a kind of mechanistic worldview as opposed to the more pastoral one is an interesting, I think you can map on some things going on there. Even just the different forces, right? How Sauron and Saruman are kind of aligned, but Saruman wants the real power, and there's a tension there. And then the alliances that the men and the elves are trying to forge, and the fragility of that. I think a lot can be mapped onto to what was going on in their own world in terms of the dynamics of World War II and the fragility of geopolitics at that time. So I think that's one sense in which we should read the text, and then I think there's a spiritual sense in which we should read the text. I know Tolkien obviously is not quite Lewis in that he's so overt about some of the symbolism. That said, certainly there is a great struggle about the soul going on in these pages, and I think as a Catholic, you can certainly see Tolkien's Catholic imagination informing so much of the story.
Mhm.
Um, and so all three of those things have to be kind of balanced as we read it. I mean, I wouldn't want to skip through the fantasy and myth as if that's insignificant to get to a sort of a
Mhm.
spiritual or political reading, but I do think those are all present.
Yeah, I agree that they're present. I think that more so than in either of Lewis's fictional series, the literal mythic level has to predominate.
Yeah.
It's primarily that. And I think Tolkien's pretty, from my understanding, I've read less of Tolkien's correspondence than I have of Lewis's, but my understanding is that Tolkien's pretty clear that that's what he cared about. That's what he was consciously working on. And the other stuff came in as he wrote in accordance with his values, in accordance with the way he viewed the world. So that, this is a distinction I like to make in writers between the author's intent and the author's accomplishment.
Mm.
The author always accomplishes more than they intended to and other than they intended to, and it's always legitimate to talk about those things. And I think that a lot of the spiritual and political falls under that accomplishment more so than intention. And I think as long as we keep that in mind, there's no harm in talking about those things and showing the ways in which we do know that he was a Catholic, and we do know quite a lot about the character of his faith as a Catholic. And we can see that playing out in the choices that he makes in these, how he paints the heroes, how he paints the villains, how the action goes, the sense of providence that underlies this entire thing. Gandalf comes off looking like a genius for picking hobbits, but he didn't really pick the hobbits. I mean, it just sort of happened that way. He picked Bilbo, not because he thought it's important that hobbits do this thing, but he was like, I need a thief. A hobbit's the right one for the task. And on a whim, he chooses Bilbo to be the one to go with the dwarves. And then that brings the ring to the Shire, and that sets all this stuff in motion. So there's a hand that is not Gandalf's that is guiding all of this. And the best Gandalf is doing is getting little hints of that and trying to cooperate with it where he can. I think all of that is, that's deeply spiritual. And I think that is an ineliminable, yeah, uneliminatable part of this text. You can't really talk about the tale well without addressing the fact that there is, I mean, there is a God in this world. Iluvatar is there above everything, and everything that's going to happen has been sung before, and he was there singing it into the shape that it was going to be in, right? So I think that's all very valid.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, so that said, then with that in mind, we have to then talk about what we do with these different races and the kind of way that they're essentialized, I guess, maybe a decent term for it. So
Mhm.
my proposal would be that we understand each of the races as part of human nature.
Mm,
So that's why the essentialist kind of aspect of it works.
mm,
Of course, they aren't so essentialist that there's not diversity within those kinds.
yeah.
You do see struggles within races and different tendencies. I mean, Frodo and Bilbo are very counter to the essentialist depiction of a hobbit.
Yeah.
Um, and there is moral complexity in someone like a Boromir.
Yeah.
But that the elves kind of speak to our higher inclinations,
Hmm.
the dwarves to our lower ones, not in a sinful sense, but in the sense of one the earthiness,
Yeah.
building, mining, accumulating. Hobbits do speak to that kind of leisurely pastoral mode of life that many are attracted to. I'm not particularly attracted to it, but they are. I think orcs and some of the evil characters are meant to depict our tendency towards domination, towards exploitation of nature and others. And then the humans in the book are probably the most ambiguous, right? There you can come up with a list of the good humans in the book, you can come up with a list of the bad humans in the book, you can come up with a list of humans who change or who have been on both sides of that. Boromir or Theoden at the begin when you first encounter him, he's kind of
Hmm.
in the middle. And so humans are torn in between all these different tendencies. And so the question kind of at the throughout the book is, what is man going to do? And of course, Elrond, because he's got that sort of more heavenly mindset, sees humans as kind of a danger, right? They're just going to destroy themselves. There's not much there. Um,
Although let's keep in mind that he's Elrond half Elven.
that's true. That is true. But anyway, so I think that's how I would answer something like that. And this also raises another question, right? Orcs. What do you do with
Mhm.
orcs? People, I've heard that said too, that orcs are too simplistic. They're all
Mhm.
fallen and there's no redemption for them. We never see a good orc or an orc
Yeah.
change his mind or something. And it's like, well, maybe if this was a different kind of work,
Yeah.
or the races were doing different things in this world, then maybe that would be warranted. But
Yeah.
because they're one facet of humanity, they can't.
Yeah. Yeah. I think this is I feel like the essentialist argument. First of all, I will say I do like the idea of essentially reading Middle Earth as the human soul, and then all the various things that are in Middle Earth are then different dynamics within the human soul. I think that makes for a very compelling allegory. I also would say that I think the essentialist argument is trying to do something. He's trying to make a claim that I don't think the text itself is trying to make a claim. It's trying to claim, which is that Tolkien is trying to model our world in some way in how Middle Earth is set up. it's a myth. And in myth, you do get a lot more types. In myth, you do have a lot more, these guys are bad and we're good, and that's the way it is. I think you have to buy into the type of storytelling that it is, but also you have to look relative to the world that they actually live in, how they came about. This
Right.
is not a world in which everyone was kind of created at a equal level, moral level, and then this fall happened, and so now people are struggling between fall and the elves were made for a completely different purpose than men were made for at a completely different time and in a completely different way. And the dwarves were a false attempt to make elves by
Hmm.
one of the Valar who sort of jumped the gun a little bit on that. So
And the
there
orcs were
are,
twisted elves,
yeah,
right?
that's right. That's right.
They were made that way, but
Yeah.
it was, and so that's what happens when you take something good and
Yeah.
totally break it.
The reason there's no good ones is because they were made out of distorting these things. I think it's also important to keep in mind that the elves are, when we take our broader view and look at the Silmarillion, the elves are not all good.
That's true.
And they're not all they do represent the highest parts of human nature in the sense that it's the striving for the really great things. But we have to remember what Lewis says about a great soul. Out of a great soul, you can get a great sinner or a great saint. And that's what happens with the elves. They're going to their actions ring through the ages in a different way than human actions do because of the power they command. But they're not just all good, right? So I do think that within the fellowship and some of these individual characters we do see a little bit of dismantling of that. It's more the essentialism is more where the characters begin from than how they have to behave with the exception of the orcs.
Which
But
here
I
is
also
where
think
you,
that,
oh, go ahead.
but I also think that there's a sense in which, yeah, this essentialism, if it's there, it's not such a big deal because of the type of story that it is. Right.
No, I think you're right. And I think, too, this may be another area where Tolkien's sort of Catholic worldview is coming into play because teleology matters a great deal. So the beginning, determining the trajectory of the thing makes a lot
Mhm.
more sense to him than
Yeah.
maybe to a modern person. Because I think a lot of modern people, I know it's talked about with like Rings of Power and stuff, like, oh, maybe there will be a good orc or something, people kind of want to
Mhm.
see that. And it's
Mhm.
like, yeah, I mean, I get why we want to see that. We had a conversation. I had a conversation with Kristen Rudd a couple of years ago about monsters and
Mhm.
how there is like that impulse to want to see a monster redeemed is, I think,
Mhm.
a Christian one and a good
Yeah.
one.
Yes.
But given that the significance of telos, the beginning really does determine the ending. And so if you take a creature that's totally warped and bent, then that's what the ending will be, if that's how they begin. And so anyways, yeah, I think that's fair.
Um, I'm gonna resist pulling on that hair. So thank you said Rings of Power. I'm gonna resist pulling on that string.
Oh
Maybe
yeah, that maybe that's another
it's gonna
bonus
back it up.
episode at some point.
But it's gonna become the Tolkien podcast. Um, yeah, so I will say that maybe just in case there's anyone out there like me, and this closes the loop on where I started with Hobbits, where most of my friends, when they look at these books, and my wife is among these, it's the Hobbit lifestyle they pine for. They see themselves as hobbits. They want to imitate hobbits, all these sorts of things. Um, Not me. It's the elves that I connect with most. If I could visit any place in Middle Earth, it would not be Hobbiton, it would be Rivendell. And if I had to pick a second, it would Lothlorien would come before Hobbiton would. I think I should like to see Hobbiton, but I think an afternoon would be enough. One doesn't need to spend much time there. So
I'd put
if
it
I were
even
doing,
below. I'd put it even below Gondor or somewhere like
oh
that.
yeah, oh
Yeah.
yeah,
Things are
yeah, for
happening
sure.
in Gondor. That's an exciting place to be.
Well, and that architecture, man. I mean, I care about those things. I love me some cathedrals. I do like towers, right? And the danger of my soul is that I do go in for towers. And so if you're listening and your soul yearns for towers as well, beware because, Barad-dûr and Orthanc are constantly trying to draw you towards them. But that said, like I do want to see the Towers of Gondor, and I think there is something great about that, and the book supports that, right? Well, the hobbits have this quiet existence, but the greatness of the hobbits actually consists in them being willing to set that aside for a time to go out and play a role on the world stage that they feel wildly unprepared for. They don't measure up in every sense of the word. But because they do, the world is saved. And the reality is, if they were unwilling to do that, then even that idyllic beauty they had would have been destroyed as well.
Hmm.
Because We see that you see how great the stretch of Mordor is, that it's already touching the Shire, even though it is at the other extreme of the map from Mordor, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, there has to be sort of a room for both, I think, just in terms of human disposition, that there are people who I think are drawn to the Hobbit life.
Yeah.
And
Again,
that's not a
Wendell Berry,
bad
right?
thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, Wendell of course, sure. I like Wendell writing, but I'm not ever really compelled to go, hobby farm or do
Yeah.
something, go live out in the country when I read that. In fact, I usually find it kind of not boring. Boring's the wrong word, and only boring people get bored. But you know what I
Mhm.
mean. I find it unexciting or unstimulating. Like I would rather live in a city.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I'd like the speed of the city life, and I don't think that's bad either. Though that comes with its own set of risks and dangers, just like the rural life does too. And
Yeah.
so how we navigate that, I think what happens is sometimes you get rural people who start writing think pieces about how bad cities are,
Hmm.
and that's not great. And then you get city people who start writing think pieces about how bad agrarian life is, and it's like, well, no, we kind of need all of this, but maybe not everybody is equally suited for both. And
Yeah.
so,
Maybe we could let the agrarian people write about the joys of the agrarian life, and the rural people write about and so on and so forth. And then that way we have a chance of seeing what's good in each one rather than everybody declaiming the evils of the other one.
that's right. That's right.
Yeah, I feel that same way too. We have a lot of things to get to,
We
and
do, and we have not gotten into the text much yet.
I right now.
Yeah.
Now let's maybe start with this structurally at a very large level. This is one of the things that I was really paying attention to this read. Um, it helps me to keep things in their proper place, and also it's something that we're meant to see because originally, of course, we talk about this as being a trilogy. It's often published as three books, although I'm reading from the single volume edition, which features now a best-selling epic motion picture journey. Um, but the
I've
truth of
got
the
it.
matter is nice. Yours is nicer than mine. The truth of the matter is that it's six books. I mean, the only real meaningful division in it was the six-book division, and it was printed in three volumes for really ease. And so I think it's important to think about the structure of the books. And just quickly, the first book is entirely concerned with getting the ring out of the Shire and to Rivendell. And so it culminates with the arrival at the borders of Rivendell.
Which takes a lot longer, of course, than if your first exposure is the movies.
Yeah.
You're not quite ready for the length of time that they spend in the Shire and getting out of the Shire and the
Yeah.
sort of painful geography of it all.
Both in terms of number of pages and in terms of amount of time that it takes them to make the journey, right?
Yep.
It's not quick. And then the second book is the forming, really, the second book is the only time the fellowship actually exists, right? The fellowship is formed, you got the Council of Elrond, and the fellowship sets out. And at the end of that second book, the fellowship that was formed, not even at the beginning of that book, has dissolved. Or at least been broken, I should say, right? That's Tolkien's term for it. And so that leaves us with the hobbits going off one way and everybody else going off a different way. And from that point, when I say the hobbits, I really mean Frodo and Sam because Merry and Pippin are going to count as others for the purposes of the rest of the book. So from there on out, it's going to be an alternating structure of book three is going to be Fellowship, book four will be Hobbits, book five will be Fellowship, book six will be Hobbits, and then of course book six also has to deal with all the lengthy epilogue material of bringing it all back together, in the same way that Fellowship had to bring everyone together in the beginning, right? So that's the structure. And I found this way through that structure really struck me a lot more because my favorite parts of the series are the fellowship parts.
Yep. Same.
I really don't enjoy Sam and Frodo and Gollum on their travels. I love the fellowship parts. And so when I got to the end of book five, I was like, oh, it's only hobbits from here on out. What are we gonna do? And it actually, thankfully, that last part of book six did not go as it was actually a lot shorter than I had feared. So, but that's the general structure of the thing. So what we have here with this first book is we have the setting out and this first stage of the journey, which is already kind of an improbability. I mean, it's definitely an improbability. It's kind of an impossibility that with the Nazgul abroad and they know they're looking for a Baggins in the Shire and they're already at the Shire, that somehow these hobbits, with only the help of Aragorn, would be able to win through and make it to Mordor. And Gandalf is not there. The elves haven't come. I mean, and somehow they've got to break through. To me, this is very much like this makes me think of guerrilla warfare, specifically of the like World War II France Maquis variety, where it's deep in enemy occupied territory and you're kind of maneuvering and dodging, and it has that kind of attention to it. That's a really, really fun flavor that the first of the six books has for me.
Yeah, so yeah, I think you're exactly right. I was wondering about Frodo. So obviously in The Hobbit we get Bilbo, and I guess in many ways they're similar characters. I mean, we're constantly reminded that Frodo is related to Bilbo and that he's always loved spending time with Bilbo, and they share many of the same qualities.
Mm,
Is Frodo a good hero? And if so, what makes him a good hero?
mm. I think he is. We'll talk about this more later. I don't think he is the protagonist of I mean
Agreed.
obviously there's loads of protagonists, but in terms of like, who's the character it's really focused on, I don't think it's Frodo, I think it's Sam, but I we will have time to discuss that later in later episodes. But I think Frodo is a good hero, and I think what makes him a good hero is something that was downplayed in the movies. And again, we'll talk about that later as well. And that is he's brave.
Hmm.
uh he's not laboring under a false sense of what he's capable of, or he's not thinking he's going to take on the world single-handedly and defeat it or something like that. But he sees a thing that has to be done, and he's willing to do what he can to try to make that happen.
That's right.
And that to me that's Frodo's power and that's Frodo's heroism. And that's a very everyday kind of heroism, right? That's the heroism of the person laboring under depression who manages to get out of bed in the morning. Like if you struggle with depression and you make it out of bed in the morning and get started on your day and just make a start on those dishes, then you're doing what Frodo did. And Frodo just did that 50,000 times until he wound up at the edge of the fires of Mount Doom, right? And I think that's a beautiful and very modern type of hero.
Agreed. Yeah, I think Frodo's one of those characters that's not you don't find any sort of oversimplification in him. There are those tensions and contrasts and sometimes even contradictions,
Mm,
in him that he wants to be in the Shire, he wants to be with his friends, he wants to just kind of live a nice life, but he can't, and he feels that pull of duty and is
mm,
willing to set aside the desire to go back to Heidi White, in order to take up the greater duty, which he recognizes as his calling. I mean, the one wonders how the Council of Elrond would be resolved without that moment where Frodo just says, "I'll do it."
yeah, yeah, that's right. And I feel like Gandalf has an inkling that that's what needs to happen, but nobody else does, right? And they were absolutely at an impasse. Um, Yeah, and that's really cool. And then I think that getting we get so quickly onto Sam, and Sam is amazing, and we'll spend a lot of time on Sam. But what really struck me this time around was Merry and Pippin,
Yep.
and it wasn't just Merry and Pippin. There was the third Hobbit too, whose name I can't remember.
Is it Fatty Bulger?
Yeah, Fatty Bolger, who stays behind to play
Hmm.
Frodo and be the bait. But you see this, his friends come together around him and they're like, we see that you're engaged in an impossible task. And if you think we're gonna let you try to do that by yourself, you're crazy. Like it probably is impossible, but it's less impossible with friends. And that's the first Fellowship of the Ring, actually
Yeah.
is the hobbits coming together around it. And I think we run past that one way too quickly, in part because, for a lot of people, the movies control how they think about these things. The movies run past it quickly. But also, even in the stories, it's just for that small moment of time and then it's gone. And all these other great and incredible and mind-blowing things happen over the next couple thousand pages that can make you lose sight of that. But right here at the beginning, and it's going to be echoed at the end when you have the harrowing of the Shire and it's hobbits again, a fellowship of hobbits again at the end. You have the first fellowship of the hobbits without which the story never makes it out of book one.
Yeah. What do you think then? Because I think you're right. I think part of what makes this so beautiful is the community around Frodo that assists him in doing what he needs to do. And of course, he's never without Sam. That's a huge
Mhm.
part of what's coming in the next two books. But at the end of the first book, I've always sort of wondered about his thought process. And I understand why the Boromir situation where Boromir wants to take the ring spooks him, freaks him out, causes him to realize he needs to maybe do this without the rest of them.
Mhm.
And yet, I often wonder about that choice. that he
Mhm.
doesn't consult anybody and he just decides to go it alone. Sam just happens to, be smart enough to piece together what's going on, which perhaps
Mhm.
is why he's the right person to go with him. But to leave that community, to leave that support,
Yeah.
um, in some sense, I mean, it reminds me of hell, right? It's that kind of
Mhm.
turn inward of inside oneself, and it
Yeah.
almost seems that's kind of what happens. And of course, within this struggle, he begins to feel the pull of the ring, and so
Yeah.
I've always wondered, like, is that choice to go it alone? I mean, on the one hand, you could say it's very pious. He doesn't, he's trying to make the right choice. He's trying to do the right thing. He wants to destroy the ring. This is the best way to do it. On the other hand, it's like he knows that pull is there, and to be by
Mhm.
himself is probably not a good place to be.
Yeah. Yeah. One wonders whether he hasn't, whether the ring isn't already pulling him and that's not influencing the decision to choose to be alone. Because if the ring can separate him off from everybody else, then it will get him. We see that later. If it weren't for Sam, the ring would win. And so I do wonder if some of that wasn't due to that influence. But let's be fair to Frodo. I mean, it's an impossible situation because you've
Right.
just seen one of the people who's meant to be your protector try to harm you. There's a wonderful line that Lewis has in the beginning of Paralandra when Lewis, the narrator, is trying to get to Ransom's house and he's being beset by this sort of demonic assault. And he finally makes it in there, and in the room there's an Eldil, these angelic beings in this text. And he has this experience where he says, I felt quite certain that it was good, but I also wasn't sure that I liked goodness nearly so much as I had supposed. And this is a gloss on that famous Narnian text of Aslan is not safe but good. He's not
Uh,
safe because we're not good, right? And Ransom says, how if food turns out to be the very thing you can't eat? How if home happens to be the one place you can't live? How if your comforter turns out to be the one person you can't be with? Then indeed the last card has been played. And that's kind of the situation Frodo finds himself in. The people who were meant to be his protection, his comfort, his guides to lead him to this thing, all of a sudden he sees any one of them could fall to the ring and he wouldn't have the power to resist them. He only gets away from Boromir really by blind chance. And so blind chance, which happens a lot in these books if you keep track.
gotcha.
How blind is it really? So he is faced with this impossible choice of I don't know if I can do it alone, but I don't know that I can do it with them either.
Right.
And
Right.
I think there's nothing incompatible about saying that the ring might have been pushing him to pick the alone option, even while the alone option might legitimately have been the best of the bad options he had in front of him at the moment.
Sure.
Right.
Sure. Yeah, no, I think that's true because, even if you I mean he didn't know that Boromir was gonna die. And
Hmm.
so there's that dynamic going on, but there's also the fact that even if something were to happen to Boromir, if he was cast out of the Fellowship or, was killed or whatever, you still have seven other people who could ha
Gimli could turn,
yeah,
right? Aragorn could turn.
Aragorn
Legolas
could
could
certainly
turn.
turn. I mean, you do get the feeling Aragorn is probably the closest to being on the edge of the rest of them.
Mhm.
He's a noble character throughout, but he recognizes that temptation in a way Boromir never does.
Yeah.
Boromir from the beginning is, well, we need to use the ring to defeat our enemies and then we can destroy it, but let's defeat our enemies first. And from the beginning Aragorn knows that you can't do that, but
Yeah.
that choice is still ever in his mind, kind of hovering
And
right there.
and and those two sides there, Aragorn and Boromir in that moment, both very human perspectives on this thing, and very much influenced by who they are.
Yep,
Boromir is the son of the steward of Gondor, the stewards who've been sitting here, standing in the gap, waiting for the king to come back for generations, and holding Mordor off this. And I love the way that this gets put later on that, for everyone else in Middle Earth, this war is new. But in Gondor, they never stopped fighting this war. They've been keeping ceaseless vigilance. And then when Sauron came back and the tower starts rebuilding itself, they're like, okay, here we go. Right. And where was everybody else in Middle Earth then for all those long years when we were keeping watch and when we were patrolling the borders and we were getting our butts kicked by the first waves of his army? So Boromir's like, this is war. I know war. You guys only know about war.
yeah,
On the other hand, we have Aragorn, Isildur's heir, who sees exactly what happens when you think his whole life is determined by the story of how it ruins the world when you think you can appropriate the tool of the enemy rather than just getting rid of it. Right.
Yep.
And I love that. Yes, we know that Aragorn is right because we get the rest of the story, but Tolkien doesn't rush to proving that Aragorn is right. He lets us sit in this tension for a bit and lets us wonder, wouldn't it be better if, how maybe Borman's got a point. Like, how many lives could be saved if we would just, not orc lives, if we would just, orc lives don't matter, use the ring and destroy. Sorry, it's Tolkien. Um, I love that the how effortlessly he's able to portray that because each man has a place that they're coming from. But to your point about your starting place, I think maybe you didn't say it exactly this way, but I'm going to paraphrase you this way, that your starting place greatly influences your tendency without determining where you'll end up. And
Mm-hmm.
so both men have these tendencies. they're both they both have access to a certain kind of wisdom based upon where they've come from. But I think we see in Boromir ultimately does make the right choice and does give his life nobly and die a hero.
That's
That
right.
he's able to transcend the limitations of his past traumas. And of course, we see Aragorn struggling with his own darkness, and he is ultimately going to also transcend that and win that. Every character has to be tested.
Yep.
Every character has a point that they come to, some more overt than others. And even everyone among the wise, Gandalf is tested, Elrond is tested, Galadriel is tested, right? The ring comes as a crisis into the life of each powerful person, saying, how will you choose to use your power? Will you use it for the good of others, or will you use it for yourself? Because that's ultimately what the ring is. The ring is about making everything about you. You
Mm.
become the Lord of the Rings, and that brings elves, dwarves, and men under your dominion. And if you've got that, you rule the world.
Yeah. Yeah, there is no neutrality in that struggle.
No, that's right.
But that's kind of where we want to default. That's what the hobbits want, right? They want to be neutral, or just not really be involved at all. And
Yeah,
even the far reaches of Middle Earth are affected by this. So everyone has to kind of decide which side they're going to choose, and
yeah,
both
yeah.
in terms of a sort of corporate, but also there's that individual struggle with each of them
That's
as
right.
well.
And
And
one of
there's
the
that pernicious lie, right? Well, maybe I could be the one that does
that's
it.
right. It won't hurt me. I'm special.
Yeah,
Yeah, nobody's special when it comes to the ring.
that's right.
You can't take that kind of power and not be changed by it. And there's a constant reflection on, do the ends justify the means?
Yep,
And the unflinching answer of the Lord of the Rings is no.
that's right.
Because at the end of the day, if you're willing to sacrifice the means for the sake of the ends, you will never reach the ends that you want to. The very fact of taking those means will change you into the kind of person who will not reach that end that you aim for.
Mm,
So the only way to bring good out of the world is to refuse to do the evil. For
that's
doing the lesser evil or bringing evil and making it your tool for the sake of bringing about good renders you the kind of person who will never want to do the good.
And this is exactly why Lord of the Rings is the perfect antidote to someone who is really drawn towards Nietzsche.
Mm, mm.
Because that is, I mean,
Yeah,
that's the lie, right? If
yeah.
you take the ring, you'll be the Uberman, you'll be the thing, you'll your will determine what happens.
Yeah, the will to power, that is the highest good in Nietzsche, and the ring represents exactly that.
Yeah.
Yeah,
That's
you're
why it's
exactly
such a
right.
compelling MacGuffin. It's
Yeah,
like it really is a mirror, it's a test, it's an enduring question, and one
yeah.
has to make a decision.
See, that's something I think modern writers could really learn from is that I think because I think what you said is exactly true. It's a compelling MacGuffin because it's not morally neutral.
Right.
We constantly want to say like, well, the power isn't good or bad in itself. It's how you use it. And if the right person gets it, Tony Stark can take the Infinity Stones and they're this great thing. And that's cool and everything, and it's wonderful. But we have lots of those stories in our day. But what about the stories that say, okay, but the thing itself is not morally neutral? And so the question of can you use it really turns upon the question of what are you willing to allow yourself to be made into? The Lord of the Rings is the most powerful and sustained modern reflection on that I know in fiction.
Yeah, maybe we can say we're living in a post Jurassic Park world, right?
Mm,
Everything maybe before Jurassic Park, that kind of story was more easily told, but after Jurassic Park, right, they didn't spend any time asking whether they should. It was just about whether they could, and that's kind of been the trajectory, isn't it? Like
Yeah. Which is funny because Jurassic Park is entirely about
it's a
saying,
warning.
no, you shouldn't have.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, for all of its celebration of science, it is an anti-scientism
Yeah,
tale. Yeah,
that's right.
absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, I'm gonna take a hard left into Tom Bombadil.
Yes, I also wanted to talk about Tom Bombadil.
Yes, I'm really excited to hear what you have to say about Tom Bombadil. I will set this up by expressing an experience that I'm going to go out on a limb and say I'm not the first or only person to have had with Lord of the Rings, which is when I was reading the Tom Bombadil chapter the first time through this book, my reaction, I don't remember exactly what I thought, but it was something along the lines of, "What? What is even happening right now? This is so random and ridiculous. Like, Tolkien has no idea how to edit. This shouldn't be here." I do not think that anymore, but I was really blindsided by him and I did not know what to do with him. And I've met a number of people who are just like, yeah, like Tom Bombadil, like what the heck, right? So let's see if we can give some purchase on what the heck with Tom Bombadil, and I'll let you go first.
Well, I remember when I first read it, I felt similarly. I think because I was so young when I first read it and had seen the first movie before I read the rest of the books.
It
And of
has
course, Tom
nary Tom
Bombadil
Bombadil
is
in
not
it.
in it.
That's
So,
right.
uh, you're like, first it's weird. You're like, I don't
Hmm.
recognize this person. And then it's long.
Hmm.
He's got these songs that go on for forever and ever. And I think the way I thought about it originally was this is boring and I'd like to
Yeah.
get to something more exciting. It's almost like when you decide to do the Bible in a year reading plan, and you
Mm.
get to Leviticus, everything's great. Then you get to Leviticus. It's like, oh, this is really boring. That's kind
Yeah.
of how I felt with that. But like you, I feel very different now. Um, but I'm also not, I don't feel like I'm any closer to understanding what or who Tom Bombadil is.
Mm. Well, he's the eldest.
He do I, well, yeah, right, exactly. But
What's
why?
that mean?
How? Who?
He's
Um,
he's literally not in the Silmarillion, so
right. So it's very confusing and I mean I think this is all intentional on Tolkien's part that
yeah,
he's completely kind of untouched by anything bad in the world.
yeah.
Um, I mean, we seem to get the feeling he could actually handle the temptation of the ring. He could
Can I
wear
can
it. He would stay
I read you that
visible.
passage?
Yeah, please.
Um, uh, Show me the precious ring, he said suddenly in the midst of the story. And Photo, to his own astonishment, drew out the chain from his pocket and, unfastening the ring, handed it at once to Tom. Photo's powerless to resist Tom's request. It seemed to grow larger as it lay for a moment on his big, brown-skinned hand. Then suddenly he put it to his eye and laughed. For a second, the hobbits had a vision, both comical and alarming, of his bright blue eye gleaming through a circle of gold instead of the eye of Mordor. Right? Then Tom put the ring around the end of his little finger and held it up to the candlelight. Doesn't disappear. For a moment, the hobbits noticed nothing strange about this. Then they gasped. There was no sign of Tom disappearing. Tom laughed again, and then he spun the ring in the air, and it vanished with a flash. Photo gave a cry, and Tom leaned forward and handed it back to him with a smile. And I almost kind of pictured Tom reaching out and reaching behind Photo's ear and being like, "Oh,
Yeah,
here it is."
that's right.
Yeah,
Yeah, it's a very strange and so then it becomes the question at the council, right? Should we just give it to Tom
right.
and he can keep it safe? But it doesn't seem like he would care. He doesn't
Yeah,
care really about the
Gandalf's like
threat of Sauron.
he would lose track of it because he doesn't it's not the type of thing he cares about, and so he just misplaced it at some point. Eventually, Sauron would find it again.
So it's not tempting to him because he doesn't really care to control others.
Hmm.
He also wouldn't be an effective guide for it because he just doesn't care about really the threat of Sauron. Um, which places him in just a really interesting location. I mean, there's certainly an analogy, at least in my mind. The first thing I go to is sort of the impassibility of God in a way.
Oh wow,
Um, that he's kind
oh
of
wow, you were
unaffected by what
there.
happens in the world, and it just doesn't. It's not. He's not really tempted by the things that us as finite creatures would be tempted by.
Hmm.
Um, but I don't know if I feel like that's too flat of a reading of him to just say, well, he's a sort of
Yeah,
divine creature.
yeah.
Um,
I think we can do better than that.
I think so too, but I don't know. I just don't know. He's one of those things that like I'll wake up at night sometimes and wonder like what is
Tom
Tom Bombadil?
Bombadil keeps you up at night.
Yeah.
You have a that's a blessed life. Um, okay, here's what I think. Tom Bombadil is Fey.
Mm.
We have to read him in light of fairy. And this is specifically the fairy tradition in which the fairies are the older spirits of the land. They're not the spirits of the dead. They're not the fallen angels who left heaven but didn't throw in with Satan. They're not the ugly children of Adam and Eve. They are these primal spirits who were there before humans came on. And as humans spread out and take dominion over the earth, the spirits have to recede and become less to make space for them. And some of them resent this and become kind of angry. And we see this with Fangorn, right? I mean, Fangorn is one of these spirits of a place that has become very bitter and is very antagonistic to the later born of Iluvatar's children, elves and men and dwarves and hobbits and all those sorts of things. So I think that's the key to Tom being eldest. It's
Mm.
not actually that he is, it need not be that he's the first creature made, the first rational creature made. Maybe the elves actually did come before him, but he's eldest in the sense that he represents what Middle Earth was for all of those long ages and eons when there weren't even elves yet. A whole age of the world passes before the elves get created. The Valar get impatient waiting for the elves to be created, right? So Bombadil is he belongs to a completely different history and a completely different order of being than everything else, and especially than the ring belongs to. The ring represents the will of Sauron, which he poured into it at its creating. Sauron was the top lieutenant of Morgoth, and Morgoth was a Valar who was involved in this war about how the history of Middle-earth would progress. Tom was never a part of any of that story. He's always off to the side doing his own Tom Bombadil thing. Because of that, there's a kind of authority that he has that is just the authority of the world, of the natural places, of the natural realm, and that's why he's able to, rescue the hobbits from the Barrow Wights. That the domain of death has to submit to the power of Tom Bombadil, which is, after all, as it were, the height of natural power. According to this reading, fairies are not supernatural; they're hypernatural. They're the height of natural power, which puts them in an interesting relationship to humans, which are less than fairies in natural power, but also supernatural. And
Mm.
then also makes them not angels who are purely supernatural, right? I think that's where Tom sits too. And so he can pick up the ring and not at all be tempted by it, not be affected by it. It doesn't make him invisible. He can replace Sauron's eye with his own little eye and kind of do so playfully. He's like, I see you, right? Because he is completely unrelated to that. He's outside that whole hierarchy, right? He's not
Mm.
subject to it in any way. But also for that reason, he can't become the guardian of the ring because that would be to step into our history and take a role. And that's
Mm.
not something, whether or not Tom Bombadil could do that, Tom Bombadil won't do that because I'm pretty sure he couldn't do that and still be Tom Bombadil. I think
Right.
he'd need a new name if he were to step into history. In the same way that Morgoth eventually, that's not his original name, and that's the name he eventually gets from coming into history. So I think that's how I read him. He became less confusing to me when I began to think about him in terms of the entire tradition, that there's a whole different order of creation. That's the Fey realm that lies alongside of ours and that is older than ours. And suddenly it was like, oh, hello,
Mm.
there's Tom for you.
Yeah, because I think at one point doesn't Goldberry say something like, "Well, he is,"
Yeah,
um, which I think at first I think another that's another reason why I've always I don't know, is that a God thing because of the I am, but I think you're right. I think your theory would be able to kind of explain that phrasing without making it sort of extra cheesy. Yeah, no, I think that's compelling. You've tentatively convinced me.
I'll take it. That's high praise. I'm tentatively convinced. Yes.
Well, I just don't know if I'll ever fully,
Well, yeah.
or strongly assert he's one thing or another. It's
Yeah.
just
Well, and what I hope for with that interpretation, because I think that there's an excess in Tom Bombadil that has to remain no matter what you do with him.
yeah,
And so I hope that, to my mind at least, the Fey element preserves rather than rationalizes that excess. It doesn't domesticate it entirely to the realm of comprehension. It's to
sure,
say, yeah, what he is this thing that is by nature incomprehensible by those of us that belong to another realm, and it may be in himself incomprehensible because in fairyland things don't follow straight lines. And so, you know, I made the suggestion before that I think that maybe all of our knowledge is apprehensive and not comprehensive, but whether that's true or not, I think it's the case that all fairy knowledge is apprehensive.
Mm,
Knowledge of fairy things can only be apprehensive because their being is not such that it can never be pinned down and
sure.
grasped.
Interesting. Hmm.
This is why, ladies and gentlemen, I submit that I am the world's foremost fairy philosopher. Also, I
I
think
love it.
nobody is arguing for that, so
Not
I
a,
should have
not a lot of competition.
only name on the ballot. I will make this comment about the languages,
Hmm.
because this is one of those things. I've often been accused of knowing Elvish. I do not know Elvish. I would not try to learn Elvish. I think that would be an absolute waste of my time. Um, Not because it's not cool, but because it's a made up language for a series of books. I don't need that. There's enough real languages I don't know. I was not involved in translating the Bible into Klingon. Yes, it was done by Yale Divinity students. Yes, I was at Yale Divinity School. Not when they did it. I was uninvolved. I do not
At
know
least there's
Klingon.
a community of people who speak Klingon. I don't think that is true of Elvish. I don't know.
Oh,
Maybe
oh, there is. No,
are
there's
there?
definitely, yes. I know many people who have learned Elvish and will like talk to themselves in it,
Oh,
talk
interesting.
among themselves in it. But here's the thing: is I saw this video of Tolkien doing an interview when he's writing out an inscription in Elvish, and he actually he starts to mess up, and he's like, oh golly, oh I've done it there. No, wait, okay, and he realizes he can fix it and make it work. But he one of the questions he's asked is, would you like people to learn this language? And he's sort of like, oh, good heavens, no. For starters, I've never finished making it. It's not a complete language. The grammar's not done. So you can't learn it as a language
Uh,
properly, right? There's situations you won't be able to deal with. I thought that was funny, but I think it's also really helpful for people if anyone feels if you ever feel token inadequacy in the face of super fans who have been teaching themselves Elvish, just remember that Tolkien didn't that wasn't his end game with it.
right.
Right.
Mm,
It's meant to it's language is a way of conveying truths about reality, but also it's a way of conveying how reality looks to a certain culture. And that's the reason Tolkien wanted. Tolkien, who himself knew perhaps as many as 30 languages, he wanted it as a window into the cultures that he was making the languages for. And so, he started multiple languages for this series. Elvish is the furthest he got with any of them. But the point was just always, it's something that you get right away in The Hobbit, where the different songs of the different races shows you the character of the people really quickly. One of the cool moments in the very beginning of The Hobbit when they've set out is he's describing how far they get from the Shire in this one paragraph. And he says, at first, there was, blah, blah, blah. But then they came to places where it was two things. I forget the first one, but the second was, and Bilbo didn't know any of the songs.
hmm.
And that was the first indicator that you're in another place culturally is they sing different songs than you do.
And it works in reverse too when they get to Treebeard in the
Mm,
second book. He makes a comment about how they're not included in one of the songs
yeah,
about or one of the lists, which I think
that's
it
right.
sounds almost like there's a sing-songy quality to that list, but
Yeah.
they're not included. They don't know what the hobbits are because they're so
Yeah,
far
that's right.
removed.
You're not in the he has to make up verses about them later, right?
Yes.
And so you can tell in The Hobbit right away, you get a feel for it. If you compare the dwarves' song at the beginning to the orcs' song to the elves' song, you get a feel for the people right away from how they sing. The languages are the next layer of that, where
Yeah.
just hearing the words Khazad-dûm and Lorien and these types of things give you already a flavor for the culture. That's what he's after with these languages. So I think
Yes.
it's not if you want to learn Elvish, that's fine. If you got all this time on your hands, don't feel judged. I'm not talking to you. I'm talking to people who might feel like there's something wrong with them or they're not serious fans because they haven't undertaken this. To say that's to reify the wrong thing. That's not what Tolkien was interested in, even as a linguist, a philologist making the language.
Sure. Sure.
We haven't talked about like anything.
Yeah, we it's hard. I would say this. I think talking about the Fellowship of the Ring is hard specifically because it would be impossible for us, I think, especially since we've read the other two books, but even without it,
Hmm.
there's so much at the end of the first book that's left untied that
Hmm.
it's almost hard to have one isolated conversation about the Fellowship because everything that we're talking about is going to need to show up again in the second and third
Hmm.
volumes. And so, yeah, doing an episode on each one is a little difficult. Whereas I feel like in Dante, I mean, it is one journey, and you do need all three parts. So like we said in those episodes, you can't just read Inferno or whatever. But there is because they're in different domains that are metaphysically distinct. There is a
Hmm.
kind of completeness in those works, whereas Fellowship, like at the end of the Fellowship, you have to keep reading to know what goes on. I mean, to end the Fellowship would be pointless.
Yeah.
So I feel like our conversation, similarly, I mean, it's themes and motifs are being brought up that are completed or continued later, and so it's difficult to contain them in just one conversation.
Yeah. Yeah. I do want to say something about Moria. This is something that has been something, timelines can be confusing, especially going from The Hobbit to Lord of the Rings, and given Bilbo's long life stretches things more than we sometimes notice. But Balin, son of Fundin, Lord of Moria, who I believe was the same Balin of The Hobbit, who traveled with Thorin Oakenshield. And so this refounding of Moria is part of the fallout of The Hobbit. That when they get Erebor back and they have the riches of Erebor back, and the mines get going again and the forges, one of the things they do is to replant the Dwarven kingdom of Moria, and they run afoul of the same reason that the Dwarven kingdom fell in the first place, of course, with the Balrog, one of the more memorable and cool elements of Fellowship. But that whole movement through the mines, coming to that place where they finally get the account and figure out that Balin has died, and then it becomes clear exactly what's happened, and it sort of dawns on Gandalf what's going on. I love that. It's so well done. It's
Yeah.
chilling and it's wonderful suspense. It's such good writing.
Yes. No, it's really good. And it's a good sort of like critique, I guess, of wealth accumulation for the sake of wealth accumulation, right? The dwarfs don't really know when to stop.
Yeah,
Um,
that's right.
their success, once they recover their kingdom in the Hobbit, they have to keep pushing it and keep pushing it. And then they do dig deeper and they awaken things that they can't control, and that ends up being the cause of their destruction. Um, the death of Gandalf, or
Hmm.
not death of, but when he falls,
Hmm.
that made me cry this time in a way that
Hmm.
I have never cried before about that.
Hmm.
Um, I
Same
always
here.
get the hard parts when we read books out loud. Like when we did Narnia, I got the night when Aslan's killed. I got the monologue in Horse and His Boy where Aslan points out all the things that he did for Shasta through his life, and I'm just like sobbing like a baby. And my oldest son is a little more stoic, and he just looks at me like, "What is wrong with you?"
Yeah.
But when Gandalf falls, this time, I don't know. I've read that many times and been not nearly as affected, but I don't know. It got me this time.
Yeah. Well, reading it out loud is a lot harder.
That's
Uh,
true.
I find that, I'm much easier to cry when I'm reading something out loud. And yeah, there's a lot of parts of Narnia I have a hard time getting through when I'm reading it out loud to my kids. Or if I'm like quoting it in a talk, I'm speaking in front of a room full of people and
Yeah.
I'm reading something out and I'm just like, it is tough. Um, but can you say more? Do you know any more about why it got to you? Because it's hard. I can't recapture the feeling of Gandalf falling and not knowing that he's coming back. Like I
Mm,
don't remember what that feels like. And so
right.
I can't have a pure reaction to it.
In some ways, I think it was the fact that he comes back. Maybe it's more of a meditation on sort of death and resurrection,
Mm,
that in order for the Gandalf the White, you have to have this fall. You have to have a kind of dereliction of self for the other, and only once he passes through fire and death can he emerge as Gandalf the White.
mm,
Um, which I guess is kind of like it's like what Paul says about, the seed has to die before the it can grow into something new, and maybe it was just grappling with that reality now as an adult rather than as a, a young adult or a child, that feels more real. I've seen that happen now to people I love
yeah.
and care about in a way that I maybe hadn't at the time. And so that cycle feels on this end, just like how all the fellowship felt about it. It's bitter, it's horrible, it's there's that loss is real, you know, even if you know he's coming back, it's you still feel the pangs of that loss.
Yeah.
Just like when we see someone die that we love, you know, we know there's a resurrection, but it doesn't really lessen the pain any in the moment. You know, it still is hard and
That's
difficult,
right.
and it also raises that question, right? He doesn't know he's coming back necessarily,
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
I mean, we're convinced, we have faith in the resurrection, but we don't know for certain anything, you know? I mean, it's a belief we hold. I think there's reason to hold it. I don't think it's irrational, but am I 100% convinced at the end of the day? Probably not.
Mm, mm. It seems like we didn't have a whole different episode on certainty and epistemic conditions. But leaving that aside, I'm reminded by what you say of a couple of other instances of this knowing that it's going to be okay and still, and that not taking away the sorrow. The first is Jesus weeping at the tomb of Lazarus.
Yep.
When he knows he's about to raise him from the dead, he seems to have waited around so that Lazarus could die so that he could raise him from the dead. And nevertheless, he still weeps in the face of that death. And of course, Jesus' own weeping and sweating blood at his passion in the face of his own death, even though once again he knows he's gonna come back, but that doesn't make it any less painful. And that's the place where my one of my great theologians, Thomas von Balthasar, is wrong. He says that any divine knowledge in Christ would be a panacea that would render him incapable of suffering the passion.
Mm,
I think that's false to get to the text of the scriptures. But another example is Aslan in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Once he agrees with the witch that he's going to be sacrificed, he is deeply down. He's so down. He's so down that Peter's talking to him and he doesn't even hear what Peter's saying. He has to ask Peter to repeat himself. This is mind-boggling when you think of who Aslan is, that he is in fact Christ in that story. He the girls can't cheer him up, and he wants them to put their hands on him, not to comfort them, but to comfort him. He says, so that I can know you're there. He's afraid that his grief is so encompassing that he won't even be aware that they're with him. He knows the deeper magic from before the dawn of time. He knows that he's going to come back, and yet it doesn't actually have anything, it doesn't in any way weaken the pain that he feels in that moment. So I think that's a it's true. We started this primarily in terms of my own failure to cry here for because I know he's coming back, it's gonna be fine. But that's doesn't necessarily mean that it's not a tragedy. And of course, for himself, he has no idea he's about to go into the battle of his existence. He has that statement about there are some powers against which he's not yet been tested. This is one of them, and he can't say ahead of time whether he's going to come out on the top of that battle or not. So yeah, that's a pretty powerful and deep moment, and I think it's really good to remind us that we need to slow down over it and spend some time with it.
one feels that even now, I think, even in maybe more temporal situations, like when someone, when you know there's a, when you know there's something good that will happen, but you have to endure something that's less than pleasant, right? I mean, diet, even something like a diet, right? You have to sacrifice the food that you may want to eat in order to get a result. And
Yeah,
when you're going through that process, like, yeah, it'll work.
yeah,
If you eat less calories, if you eat better food, then this will happen. But that's a hard thing to stick it out through because
yeah,
there's that pang of, well, I really miss the food that I like, or I am hungry, feeling hungrier than I normally am, you know, these kind of things. And so the question, the willingness to endure the arduous,
mm,
I think is a tough, it's a tough thing. And so even if you know there's a resurrection, even if you know that it all works out in the end, to have to give up that thing now is tough.
yeah. And I think that's the. I mean, I don't believe the Christian story is trying to tell us that our pains aren't pains because that because all the tears will be wiped away, it won't matter that we cried. I mean, there are tears to be wiped away. Um, and we will always be the ones who cried those tears. And I think that as I read it, the Christian story is more about God's presence with us in our pain than the denial that our pain is really pain or something like that. And so I think that point's well taken with regard to this text as well. Um, before we finish, we need to say something about Galadriel and connection with Galadriel and what we're talking about here. Obviously, it's where they go next after they lose Gandalf, but also she is so old, you guys. Like her her brother was the half brother of Feanor, who created the Silmarils.
Yeah.
Like that was in over where the Valar were when they weren't even on Middle Earth anymore. Where the white ships go when they leave Middle Earth. Back when the elves had left, and then they would subsequently come back. It's before basically everything that we know in history. Before all of that, Galadriel is. So she is this really, she's really been around just forever. Um, and the weight of pain that can build up because of that, the millennia that she's lived through and all the pain and suffering she's experienced. But she's much older than Elrond is. Um, it's really fascinating to me, and it's hard to kind of wrap your head around, and so I get why the elves get world weary and want to move on, because they've seen, I mean, the first War of the Ring, the overthrow of Morgoth. I mean, so many different things. There's whole realms, there's a whole continent that doesn't exist anymore. That was where Galadriel and Elrond lived the first part of their lives
Yeah.
before Morgoth was overthrown. So um, that's really interesting. She is one of the things that really gets me about her is the way she indirectly influences the story. And one of the thing that I'll point to is how completely how she just completely changes Gimli's life. Gimli is never the same dwarf again after meeting Galadriel. She redefines his notion of beauty, and it's so much so that he's willing to fight to the death to defend the claim that she's more beautiful than any other lady. It's very chivalrous. But that's she does that not just with her beauty, but she does that with her wisdom. She does that with her kindness, and she knows this, and she's able to wield those things in a way that serves the members of the fellowship with just what they need. And that's what turns Lothlorien into this place where they can find some sort of spiritual refreshment and healing and strength to continue the journey.
Well, Florian is an interesting place for that reason. The way it's described, of course, at one point it seems to have a great grandeur, but that it's lessening, and also that it's kind of encircled. It's in some ways embattled. I mean, you even get that with the orcs are pursuing them in the woods, and fortunately, the Lothlorien elves are able to destroy that party that's coming in. But you still get the sense that there is a finitude even to something so old that it's going
Yeah.
away, and
Yeah.
there's a kind of bitterness to that. My favorite dynamic, my favorite part of this, though, is how much Gimli ends up loving her, which of
Mm.
course is strange. At first they start off on kind of bad terms because they make Gimli, they want to blindfold Gimli when he comes to the kingdom, and fortunately that's all resolved. But once he actually interacts with her, um, he becomes one of her greatest champions.
Yeah.
To the point that when anyone says anything bad about her, he's willing to fight you to the death, pretty much. Um, and so I think that's such a cool dynamic.
Yeah.
Again, maybe one of those places in which you could point to push back against the essentialist argument, right? They're not supposed to get along, but they do.
Mm. Yeah, and they have a particular historical grievance here between these elves and the dwarves because these elves suffered from the fall of Moria. Um,
That's right.
what the dwarves awakened brought evil upon the elves as well. And Legolas and Gimli have that conversation at the beginning before they get taken by the elves. But yeah, it's a completely different situation here. And yet, even though she redefines beauty for him, as we'll see later, there's still he still prefers dwarfish beauties. Aside from her, he prefers dwarfish beauties, and there's this
Mhm.
sort of um, rivalry that will arise between him and Legolas about what's the most beautiful place in Middle Earth. And they agree that if they survive the war, they'll each one will take the other and help him to see it with his eyes. And that's a really beautiful moment. But even though that's he doesn't prefer the Galadriel's woods to rocky places, I still think that what the vision of Galadriel and her beauty, which is not just her physical beauty, but also the way that she wields her beauty and her wisdom, what that works in Gimli, I think it affects how he sees every other beauty going forward. And I think it makes it possible for him to both see something of what Legolas sees in the beauty of a forest and also be able to communicate something of what he sees and the beauty of the caves underneath Helm's Deep to Legolas because he draws closer to a transcendent sense of what beauty is. It's bigger than the dwarf only sense, and they can both kind of start to meet in that higher realization of beauty.
It's a similar pull as like the cosmopolitan versus the rural or the
Yeah,
urban versus the rural. It's like there is something there for both of them, and
yeah,
they're acting as if it's, these are two mutually exclusive things, and when in reality there's a greater plane in which those two poles meet. And
yeah,
yeah, yeah.
yeah.
Good. Well, is there anything else we need to talk about in the fellowship that we haven't yet?
Probably so many things, but I think we should have to take our leave.
I think so too. And I think once we get to Two Towers and Return of the King, we'll be able to maybe circle back, and some things that start here, we can kind of finish there. And
Yeah.
yeah, I think it'll be good. But there's a lot of stuff, and B, that stuff is in development at this point in the book. And so we have to kind of keep pushing through.
Yeah, that's right.
Well, let's do end notes. Junius, what's your end note for this?
So, I'm actually glad that we have multiple episodes because it gives me a chance to spread out my endnoting a bit because there's different directions I wanted to go. For this one, I think, that we've made reference to how much other lore there is out there around this, and I've not read most of it. There's just volumes and volumes of notebooks and things that you could go through if you wanted to. And I don't. But a lot of it, there's a lot of really good stuff out there. And so I thought it would be good to point to some of that as a place where you can get more, not just more of the Lord of the Rings flavor, but more specifically of Middle Earth and of Tolkien writing about it. Of the things that have been published, leaving aside the Silmarillion, which is in a separate category, that's a must read. That's just a whole different thing entirely. But the Silmarillion reads like the prose edda of Norse mythology. It's a sort of collection of short stories and tales and things like that. Whereas I'm going to recommend The Children of Húrin,
Mm,
which is one of the three tales of the second age first age that Tolkien had this vision. He wanted to see these three tales told together, Beren and Luthien, Fall of Children of Húrin, and the Fall of Gondolin, as they would sort of be, as it were, the Lord of the Rings of the first age. And the Children of Húrin is such a deliciously perfect tragedy.
mm.
It's very Greek and very Norse in the inexorability of the tragedy of it, but it's so well written, so well told. You get Glaurung, the first dragon, features heavily into it. Lots of really cool things are happening, and you get to see a lot more of the weakness of elves, as well as of men, and what it looked like when we talk about this blood of Gondor and how strong the men of the West were before, in bygone ages. You get to see that strength of human blood in Húrin's sons. So it's super good, and it absolutely, if you like the Lord of the Rings at all, you really owe it to yourself to read it.
Yeah, I always, when I think about some of that earlier, chronologically earlier parts of the Lord of the Middle Earth corpus, I kind of think about what you always talk about with the how the Trojan War is like we're being cast in the middle of something that's been going on for a very long time.
Yeah.
And so to understand what's going on there, you have to kind of understand what's going on in the older books. And so it's
Mhm.
kind of a similar dynamic here where it's like a lot more makes sense once you pick up and read those things that happened in the earlier ages. And he alludes to it throughout the book.
Yeah.
The titles, and they'll just kind of say things, and you're like, well, clearly something happened here, and having that context helps make a little more
Yeah.
sense of things.
Yeah.
Mine is much simpler. Mine is a card game, which
Hmm.
is the Fellowship of the Ring trick-taking card game. And Jude and I bought this. Maybe I got it for Christmas or birthday or something, but they were selling them at Barnes and Noble. I don't know if they still do, but it's not a very big game. I mean, it's just a little box, kind of long, and they have like 12 different scenarios, and so you play through the Fellowship of the Ring in this trick-taking card game, and each of the character you can be different characters, and they have different powers and abilities, and you have to beat the game basically in order to move on to the next chapter. And so
Hmm.
we've been slowly playing that. We're not very far into it, but since we finished the Fellowship of the Ring, we decided we'd give it a go. So it's a fun game, the Fellowship of the Rings trick-taking card game, and they have one for each entry in the trilogy. So there's a Two Towers one and a Return of the King one too, which I suppose we'll get to when and if we ever finish the book.
That's awesome.
Excellent. Well, Junius, it's always a pleasure, always fun.
But it's especially with these books, it's a good journey and we've made a good beginning.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And listeners, we appreciate you. Thanks for going on this journey with us. Next month, we will be reading and discussing The Two Towers, the next entry in The Lord of the Rings. And in the meantime, keep reading.